Hey guys, this is Vacations, and welcome to a little different video. I've been thinking about doing this because it's actually a pretty fascinating story. Before I do my, before I decided before I decided that I was going to, before I decided to review the Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, the 2002 film, which was the first film based on the character that was released in theaters. Well, not really. I mean, there was episodes of the pilot episode of the 70s, the late 70s live action TV show made in theaters, but not in the U.S. Made in the theaters in the U.K. And so did a few other. I think the Chinese Web episode also made it into theaters. So underneath the title, The Dragon's Challenge. And also, I think another one made it under Spider-Man Strikes Back. So there were like a decent amount of Spider-Man live action TV show segments. I think they put together two-part episodes into one movie and released it, overseas, but not in the U.S. for some reason. Maybe it has to do because Stan Lee supposedly hated the show. More on that later. Actually, that was one of the. I will briefly mention that show because that was actually one of the first ever sort of optioned feature films for Spider-Man, and it wasn't just supposedly just going to be the TV show thing. Just the episodes put together. They're going to be their own stories. Um, but anyway, what I was thinking about, this is something I thought would be fun to do to talk about the Spider-Man movies that never were, that never happened. And this is I'm gonna try to make this sort of every now and then type series of videos where I'm gonna talk about the never were's. And this is one of those never were. These Spider-Man movies I'm going to talk about are some of those never were's. And what it is it's that it's talking about movies that for whatever reason never got made, and I just thought it might be interesting to talk about them, so to speak. Before I talk about Sam Raimi's film, I thought it would be interesting to have a little bit of a backstory of how long it took to finally get a Spider-Man film on on the big screen in the United States. With a big budget and that wasn't a TV show that was edited into a feature film. It's actually a pretty big journey, and I thought that this is an interesting enough subject that it deserved at least it deserved its own separate video, because if I tried to do this in the review of Spider-Man, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, that review would be way over long. So anyway, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna check through a couple links that I found on the internet talking about these other potential Spider-Man films. Now, the one that I remember, the one that I've heard of, is the one that Canon was going to do. And I had a magazine that talked about it, and for some dumb reason, well, it didn't just talk about that, it also talked about the TV show, and I got rid of that magazine. I don't know why. I got rid of it, and it's like really hard to find now. And yeah, not the smartest thing I did. That's for sure. Um, Trying to see if this is it. The Secret Histories of Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man films. Um, just checking it out, just making sure I got the right links here, folks. Um, okay. One more here. Secret History of Spider-Man movies. Okay. Go here. And I have them in my bookmarks. I'm just huh. Okay. Now, I'll start with this one. This is an article from this is information from an article on IO9. It's a secret history of Spider-Man movies. Now, in 1975 through 1976, Steve Krantz, who was one of the producers of the 1960s Spider-Man cartoons, along with Fritz the Cat, tried to launch a live-action Spider-Man movie in the mid-1970s, according to the book Stan Lee and the Rise and Fall of the American Comic Book by Jordan Raphael and Tom Spurgeon. Originally, Krantz wanted to make a splashy action fantasy musical, perhaps not that different from Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark or Spider-Man Rocks. This horrible live show that played at Universal Studios for a while that is just embarrassingly bad. You think Turn Off the Dark is bad. You haven't seen anything if you haven't seen Spider-Man Rocks. You think the scene of Spider-Man 3 is bad where Toby is dancing, to that, 70s music, trying to be, Tony Manero from the Saturday Night Fever is bad? You haven't seen Spider-Man Rocks. There's also another one where I remember it was a musical in the UK, a Spider-Man musical, where the Lizard was a villain. He was played by a puppet. Literally, it was a puppet on stage. And there was a lot of choreography and dancing. And Spider-Man's not the only superhero that's been subjected to musicals. Batman has had a musical. You also had Superman, the infamous Superman musical from the 70s. But essentially, Krantz realized that a more straightforward approach to Spidey would be more successful, and in 1976, he was pitching the studios with an outline that involved a college-age Spider-Man fighting a 100-foot-tall robot plus Nazis, and it also included the death of Gwen Stacy. Well, and predictably, it didn't get off the ground because they saw the script and were like, 100-foot-tall robot? What? Spider-Man isn't Godzilla, but maybe I think the Japanese producers who produced the Spider-Man show in the 70s where he actually has a robot. It was like I think it was the late 70s or the early 80s. It was actually it's a Japanese Spider-Man. It was called Squeedaman or whatever. It was really really bad. It was like Spider-Man meets Power Rangers. That is an absolute one of the strangest moments in Spider-Man's career. And, in any way, I mean, that's even stranger than Spider-Pig. So that didn't go off the ground, probably because 100-foot-tall robots and Nazis, and plus randomly the death of Gwen Stacy really don't compute for people, and really didn't sound like that great of a movie. But in 1977 and 1978, Columbia Pictures got into the act. And there was the disco era Spider-Man TV series, which started out as a made-for-television movie, which was released theatrically in some countries, about a grown-up Peter Parker who gets spider-based superpowers. Well, he's still in college, but it is played by an actor who's in his late 20s. He was I think about 28 when he played the role, and that's Nicholas Hammond. Nicholas Hammond played Peter Parker Spider-Man in the 70s, 1978, 79. TV series, The Amazing Spider-Man. It started out as a pilot that was aired and was enormously successful, and it became its own show on CBS. And it was very inspired a lot by the Incredible Hulk in that way. It added a lot of reality to the character Spider-Man. In some ways, the episodes of the show are some of the most the most grounded in reality, moments of the character on, any type of film, in my opinion. Amazing Spider-Man, the new Amazing Spider-Man has some moments like that, but this is the one that really does feel like there's a lot of grave situations in a lot of the episodes in the show. And I'll talk about the show in depth later. I don't want to get started on it now, but I'll just let you know I actually like the show. I'm one of the few people who actually like the show. So I grew up watching episodes of the show on VHS, The Amazing Spider-Man, the TV pilot. I watched it over and over again growing up. I have my own copy. For some dumbass reason, I sold it along with the other copies that I had. Another one that I had was this Chinese Web, which I feel so stupid about because those are hard to find now. And I should have just kept it and not be a dumbass and sell it, but I did. So I didn't, and I didn't get that much for it either. So really not the best idea what I did, but I was a kid and I wasn't thinking things through. But anyway, the Chinese Web is another one I watched a lot, which is actually the last two episodes of the show that were put together into a movie. Actually, I think it was the Chinese Web. It was like its own episode. I think it was just one long, big movie. I could be completely wrong. But anyway, actually, the show didn't get canceled because it had low ratings, like a lot of people assume it did. It got canceled because of basically the main reason it got canceled is because CBS didn't want to be known as a superhero network, which I'm like, why is that a big deal? Why wouldn't you want to be known as a superhero network? You are capitalizing on a new growing fad, and you're the first one to do it, and no one else. You don't have any competition. Why not, CBS? But no, they canceled Spider-Man for some other crap, and kept Incredible Hulk on the air, and I think they canceled Spider-Man, and then I think they canceled Wonder Woman soon after. So they didn't really want to be known as a superhero network for some reason because they thought it was a childish thing. But the show was actually pretty profitable. And I think another reason why it was canceled is also because of the cost overruns. The show was extremely expensive for a TV show back in that time period in the late 70s, mainly because of a lot of the effects that were needed for the show. There were actual a stuntman named Fred Waugh. I think it's Fred Waugh, and I think that's his name. And he would actually get in a harness with a Spider-Man costume on, and he would actually pretty much scale actual walls and buildings. And they'd have him hung up on a crane. It was like a huge, big thing. And to be honest, watching the episodes of the show again I think is a lot of fun. I think the show is a nice, wholesome, fun quality to it. That I think the main thing holding it back is because it's doesn't have any of the villains from the show, so it's really kind of hard to connect with the show with the character, from the comic. But I still think the wall crawling scenes, the ones that you actually have the stuntman actually scaling a wall, are very impressive and still impressive to this day. In my opinion, the best wall crawling scenes I've seen in a Spider-Man, in a Spider-Man film or any sort of live action scenario. It beats CGI Spider-Man crawling on walls any day of the week because you see it and it's an actual human being climbing on these walls, and it's actually really a sight to be seen. It's really a great sight. It's a wonderful sight to behold to see that. But there's other effects that are pretty chintzy, like literally like just having the actor climb over, in front of a blue screen, and then they just half-assedly superimpose it on film, so he's just climbing over an already pre-recorded, clip of footage. And that's pretty bad. And his webbing doesn't go that far. So it's all different kind of stuff. And I'll get into that even more in detail later on. But yeah, the show actually was pretty popular. And so they wanted to maybe possibly do a movie. So you had the whole thing where the pilot had, I'll talk about the pilot later. But after the TV show was on the air, some episodes were edited together and released theatrically. There's Spider-Man Strikes Back, comprising the two-part Deadly Death storyline, which is episodes 2 and 3, and the Dragon's Challenge, which is the Chinese web storyline. And so they were released theatrically, but there wasn't any plans to continue it, except actually in the late 80s, before, like in the mid to late 80s, before Return of the Incredible Hulk, to be honest, before there was even an idea to have Thor and Hulk team up. The original idea was to have Spider-Man and Hulk team up. And there's actually a rare photograph that is nowhere to be found now that was on the internet. I've seen it. I haven't seen it since I was like 12. Like I was like 14 or something. I haven't seen this picture in years, and I know I'm not the only one. There used to be an actual photograph, which is on a website, which I think was a fan site for either The Amazing Spider-Man or for the Incredible Hulk TV show. And the original plan was to team up Nicholas Hammond. He was going to come back and play Spider-Man, but in the black costume, the black symbiote costume, and team up with the Hulk, with Lou Ferrigno, Bill Bixby's the Hulk. And there's actually a photograph, which is not anywhere to be found on the internet, but it exists. I know I'm not the only one that's seen it. And it was a still with the Hulk, Lou Ferrigno and Nicholas Hammond in the black suit. But what happened was they had hired pretty much as much of the original cast from the Amazing Spider-Man show as they could, and then they had the Incredible Hulk cast. It was going to happen, and then something happened with budget. So the budget was a little bit too high or something like that, and it got canceled. And so they went with Incredible Hulk Returns with Thor instead of Spider-Man. So there was no Hulk and Spider-Man team up. And no Nicholas Hammond, getting another shot to show, prove his worth and also show up in the black costume. That would have been cool. I would have traded, Incredible Hulk Returns with Thor, and for Spider-Man and the Hulk. Come on, Spider-Man and the Hulk sounds a lot better. But yeah, that's an interesting little bit of information that not a lot of people really know. Now, in 1982, Roger Corman, he also produced, the Fantastic Four movie in 1994, which is only made because they wanted to keep the rights, which is crazy. But at the same time, I've seen the movie, and it actually has more heart and soul to it than a lot of modern day comic book movies. It's actually kind of fun to watch, even though it's really, really cheap. It seems like these characters, these actors actually, I don't know, cared about playing these characters. Anyway, he almost made a Spider-Man film, and Orion Pictures had the rights at one point, but to Corman's dismay, let the rights expire. And according to Raphael and Spurgeon's book, the Corman movie would at least been based on a treatment by Stan Lee himself, which stuck pretty closely to the comics. Stan Lee didn't care for the 70s TV show. He even said the treatment of the 70s TV show, live action show, which he, so much so to the point where he even said that, he hated it. He hated the live action 70s TV show. And I was like, and he was actually he was actually a consultant on that show. So in my opinion, I'm like, why don't you, if you hated it so much, why don't you fix it? Why don't you see why don't you tell them what you think is wrong and have the producers fix it? Instead of, saying that you hate the show and you hate it, you hate it, you hate it. And you were actually a consultant on the show. Every episode of the show had Stan Lee as a consultant. Like, I'm serious to Stan Lee. If you were actually maybe he's not really on the set, but if he was on the set every time they filmed an episode or he was sent every script, he had the power since he created Spider-Man at that point in time. He had the rights to Spider-Man. He really could have said something and they could have fixed it, but no. But anyway, the Corman movie would have been based on a treatment by Stan Lee himself, which stuck pretty closely to the comics. Peter Parker would have been a college student facing Dr. Octopus, and he would have had a few love interests, including Mary Jane Watson and a sexy KGB agent. But Lee's screenplay was probably too ambitious, including a huge sequence where Spidey fights atop of the UN building, with lots of swinging, sticking the walls, leaping, jumping, and falling, all while dodging Doc's arms. Meanwhile, Spidey also finds time to prevent a nuclear war with Russia. Which, do we really need more of that? It sounds like a precursor to Superman 4. We don't need any more superheroes trying to stop nuclear war with Russia or any other country, because that was handled so terribly in Superman 4. We don't need to see that again. But anyway, and that sounds cool. I'd love to have seen a movie where Spider-Man in the 80s was swinging on top of the UN building, fighting Doc Ock. Swinging and climbing and jumping on the the skyscraper and things. That would have been cool. But here is pretty much the most well-known one. There's another one, James Cameron's idea for a Spider-Man movie, and in 1985 to 1990, there's actually a poster for this. Canon is infamous for this. They have so many posters, and they even had a trailer, which I might have show you guys in this video, for their Spider-Man. Canon wanted to do a Spider-Man movie, and they got the rights in 1985. And Israeli cousins Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus were known for their schlocky films, including The Apple, as well as Lou Ferrigno, Hercules, and a few other stuff. Canon also ended up, producing Superman 4. But in the 1980s, they were trying to go legit via the Canon Group and Canon Films. After Corman lost the Spider-Man rights, Canon Group purchased them for $225,000 plus profit sharing, and took a 50-page pull-out ad touting Spider-Man among its upcoming productions, according to the book Superman vs. Hollywood by Jake Rawson. At first, the film was going to be directed by Tobe Hooper. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Joseph Zito, who directed Missing in Action and Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, but after he dropped out, the director's chair was taken by B-movie mastermind Albert Pyun. Yep, Albert Poontang was going to get his hands on Spidey and make the first Spider-Man movie, which would have been hell. Which would have been absolutely the worst Spider-Man movie possible, because Albert Poontang is responsible for the shittiest Captain America movie out there, 1990 film. I guess it's not as bad as the 70s TV pilot with Red Brown, but at least that has Red Brown going for it. This doesn't have anybody. Matt Salinger? Matt Salinger can't even hold Red Brown's jock strap. But anyway, he had rubber ears and all. So yeah. The guy who had Captain America had rubber ears and made the Red Skull Italian. Yeah, he had a script. He was fine with the script where the Red Skull became Italian, and that guy would have been responsible for, the first Spider-Man movie. Which, if he had gotten his hands on Spidey and he had done a Spider-Man film, it would have been years till you saw another Spider-Man movie, because of the fallout that would happen because of his Spider-Man. But early on, there were huge problems, according to Video Junkie, because Golan, despite being hugely enthusiastic about the Spider-Man character, was very unclear on the concept, and he wanted to change Spider-Man's origin to be caused by an evil scientist named Dr. Zork, who creates mutants. And Peter Parker would be a lowly employee of Dr. Zork's, who accidentally gets turned into Spider-Man and then has to fight Zork's army of mutants. And another screenplay was considered. Spidey gets turned into an 8-legged tarantula. Like a 8-legged tarantula man thing, which was actually the one that had Tobe Hooper involved. Yeah, it was a Spider-Man monster movie directed by Tobe Hooper. The first studio to acquire the rights was Canon Films, and studio chiefs Golden Globus misinterpreted the concept and wanted to do something more like Swamp Thing. In their first proposal, Peter Parker was a lowly ID badge photographer who was subjected to radiation from a mad scientist named Dr. Zork. And he turns into a hairy, 8-armed tarantula monster that must fight out the scientists' mutants' experiments before they take over the world. Naturally, producers approached the Horrormeister Hooper to direct and commissioned Leslie Stevens, the creator of Outer Limits, to pen the screenplay. Of course, that did not work, for good reason, because Spider-Man is not David Cronenberg's The Fly. Or The Fly 2. But that's the one that had the poster on their one of their catalogs, The Year of Canon. They had a Spider-Man movie poster, and they had Tobe Hooper listed as the director and the screenplay by Leslie Stevens. And of course, I love how Canon always made these posters where they'd have directors and stars set that really weren't set in stone that they were going to direct or star in the movie. Like American Ninja, for instance. There's a poster for American Ninja that has Chuck Norris in the lead role instead of Michael Dudikoff. And there's just so many of these. Like, Canon just was, in some ways, really unprofessional, but some ways just really awesome. Yeah, so Golden Globus really didn't know what Spider-Man was, Joseph Zito told the LA Times. They thought it was like the Wolfman. Yeah. No. See, folks? You can get worse than the Amazing Spider-Man lately, the new one, or the sequel, or if you don't like Raimi's films, you can get worse than that, way worse. You have Man Spider, the movie, and for us comic book fans, Spider-Man comic fans, you remember Man Spider, right? The mutation that Peter goes through in one comic arc, and also in episode of the animated series. Turns into a man spider, which is, pretty horrifying. And it's not Spider-Man. So as Don Kopoloff, the Marvel's film agent in the 1980s, told Spurgeon and Raphael in their Stan Lee book, "I would have never gone to Canon as the first choice. I went to them after I couldn't get Captain America or Spider-Man sold. The younger people in the film industry were plenty interested, but the older people were still in charge, didn't bite." Bunch of old stiffs. And according to Video Junkie, stuntman Scott Leva was considered to play Peter Parker. And it got as far as creating test shots. They also dreamed of casting Tom Cruise in the role, according to LA Times. And there actually are test shots of Scott Leva as Spider-Man. With Peter Parker ripping open his shirt, showing the Spider-Man costume. which looked a lot like the 78 costume. Looks a lot like the 70s TV show costume. And Steve Leva also, um, he had actually had a comic book cover in 1985, one of the Spider-Man comics, where he was actually used as a template for the face of Peter Parker. And I think there was a few other comics that he did some covers for from test shots. He also, I think, went to some places and conventions and places like that playing Spider-Man. And he was a stuntman and a gymnast. So he was really, honestly, really perfect for the role. Eventually, the Dr. Zort concept was dumped and replaced by a more traditional approach in which Spider-Man was going to fight Dr. Octopus, who might have been played by Bob Hoskins. And in this version, Doc Ock would have been transformed by a cyclotron explosion and would have had a hideous latex fake torso showing how his cybernetic tentacles had fused with his body. You can actually read the unproduced script by Ted Newsom and John Brancato online, and I'll put the link in the description below for you guys if you really want to check it out. I've read it; it's pretty lame. Some of the stuff that Newsom and Brancato came up with made in the Sam Raimi movies included Peter Parker discarding his glasses, which hindered his now perfect eyesight. By the time Pyun came on board, the Dr. Octopus script had been dumped in favor of another storyline about Spider-Man being pitted against a bat-like scientist turned vampire. Morbius? According to Cinema Fantastique, Volume 34. And this is a quote from Cinema Fantastique, Volume 34, when they asked Pyun about his experiences of the project, and he told the magazine this. It was a big challenge trying to figure out a dynamic way to bring him to the screen back in 1988. The villain I chose was the Lizard, but he had his own challenges with the tail and the ability to jump around. We were experimenting with centrifuges and wire work, but it was daunting on a low budget. We were fully cast and had most of the major sets built when the plug got pulled. And actually, a lot of those sets that were built for the 90s, for the late 80s Spider-Man film, were used in Masters of the Universe, the 1987 film with Dolph Lundgren, directed by I think it was Gary Goddard. I think that's who directed that. And so a lot of those sets were actually used for that film, and actually were used in the movie Cyborg. Interesting, huh? So I actually know Cyborg used sets for Masters of the Universe 2, which never happened. But Masters of the Universe actually used some of the sets, some of the stuff that they were using for the Spider-Man movie were used on sets for the Masters of the Universe film. Now, because they ultimately decided to do that instead of Spider-Man. But you saw in 1988 that they were thinking about doing it anyway in 88, but then the plug got pulled. And Stan Lee kept rejecting these script drafts, but at the same time kept bucking to play J. Jonah Jameson himself. Meanwhile, the legendary concept artist, my mentor Hubner, created some concept art, which is sadly unavailable. And Pyun was hoping to film Spider-Man at the same time as Masters of the Universe 2, using the same sets, but in the end both films fell through. That's a big problem. Actually, I got that mixed up. Masters of the Universe did not use sets for Spider-Man. Masters of the Universe 2, the sets for Spider-Man were used in Cyborg. So the Cyborg Van Damme used sets that were supposedly going to be used for the Amazing Spider-Man, the new Spider-Man movie, and the first was going to be the first ever Spider-Man movie in 1988, directed by Albert Pyun, and also Albert Pyun's other project, Masters of the Universe 2, and both of them fell through, and so the sets were actually used, for moderately good use in the movie Cyborg. And but in the end, both films fell through. A big problem, as with many Pyun's films, was funding. There simply wasn't enough money to support such a huge production, which had a $5 million special effects budget alone. And so he ended up reusing the sets, for Cyborg. And there's a few other ideas. A little bit more. Sorry about that. A little more detail on the other version, not the monster movie version. It was like they like to call it a Chuck Norris style Spider-Man with Bob Hoskins as Dr. Octopus. And after Stan Lee rejected the monster movie idea, Cannon pursued a more action-oriented game plan. They hired Joseph Zito the director of Missing in Action and Invasion USA, to direct. In this new treatment, Otto Octavius and research assistant Peter Parker are both transformed during a lab experiment involving a cyclotron. Can any science geeks or extraordinaires tell me what the hell a cyclotron is? Parker's boss turns into the maniacal Dr. Octopus, complete with a head-scratching okie dokie catchphrase, and it's up to Spidey to stop him from obtaining anti-gravity. Yeah, he has a catchphrase. That's in that script. Okie dokie is one of his catchphrases. Hoskins was considered for the part of Ock Ock, but funnily enough was an early ideal casting choice for Wolverine 2, which makes no sense. Bob Hoskins as Wolverine? No, thank you. Although it never got very far, the movie audaciously considered Lauren Bacall and Audrey Hepburn for the part of Aunt May. And for old Webhams himself, the front runner was stuntman Scott Leva. The unknown actor took promotional photos for Canon and was hired by Marvel to make public appearances and pose for comic book covers. The Zito production fell apart when its budget was severely cut. For the next several years, Canon attempted several low-budget rewrites, but their studio collapsed from financial ruin. And producer Golan held onto the rights and leveraged them to Viacom and Columbia Pictures for TV and home video distribution. This would later create a huge legal mess that sank the companies. And here's actually a little bit of article from this movie, about the movie, the late 80s Spider-Man movie that never happened from Canon. And this is actually from a website called Comic Book Resources. And they have a link to the issue, the cover, Spider-Man number 262 in 1985, which is actually a photo cover with Scott Leva as Peter Parker Spider-Man. The Spider-Man the movie trailer, which was like a 19-second long clip. And a few test shots of Scott Leva as Spider-Man. And this is actually an interview, which I think is really, really fascinating, which is from Ted Newsom, who is one of the original screenwriters on the proposed Spider-Man film. And he stopped in by the comment section on this whole sort of article, and he basically talked about Spider-Man: The Descent into Production Hell. And this is all information straight from one of the writers from this failed and never realized Spider-Man project, this Spider-Man film. Everyone liked our script. Joe, Cannon, Stan Lee, even Marvel which was very persnickety. Potential casting was discussed very early and continuously, but nothing was set. So naturally, in the internal logic of Hollywood, we were fired, and Joe brought in a friend he'd worked with before, Barney Cohen. Scott Leva was indeed in the running. If the choice was to go with an unknown, my partner then suggested a then unknown Tom Cruise. Considering we were basically thinking the John Romita style, he would have been perfect. Stan liked Scott too. I met him at the San Diego Comic-Con, and where we were hyping the project. Barney's rewrite was still very much of our story and characters, with the addition of a, to me, incredibly annoying sidekick that Doc Ock, and giving Ock a catchphrase, okie dokie, which we used once in the mouth of a minor character. The major action remained intact, and Barney added a couple more at Joe's suggestion. Excuse me. After Metacom peed on the fire hydrant a little, he added a couple of loony lines of dialogue and a non-canonical scene where Spidey beats the crap out of Flash for eyeballing the girl. The script was okayed and went into pre-production. At that time, it bore the names Ted Newsom and John Brancato, Barney Cohen and Joseph Goldman, Golan's pen name. There was a year's worth of prep, supervised by Joe. Every shot in the film was boarded out like a giant comic. The main action pieces were illustrated by Harper Goff, one of the greatest designers of all time. He worked on Disney's 2000 Leagues Under the Sea, for instance. Joe went up from Hollywood to Rome to London to South Carolina, looking for the right place to shoot a big FX-laden film. In all, Canon spent close to $1 million in prep, extremely unusual for them. The budget was roughly $20 million, again, really unusual for them, and it was a go project, until the Cannon boys ran into the Sulkines and Cans. They had taken a bath in Superman 3 and Supergirl and offered to sell the franchise. Unlike his ignorance of Spider-Man, Menachem was just a touch too old to have grown up reading Marvel. In just a couple years, but it made the difference. Golan knew what Superman was about. Cannon bought the franchise. They wooed Chris Reeve back with the promise of a great deal of dough and input into the script. And simultaneously, they bought the Master Universe franchise from Mattel, another pricey FX project with an equally priced upfront payment to the toy company. Canon had grand plans, but 3 gigantic budget movies were too much even for them. Spider-Man was the one that suffered. They slashed the budget from $20 million down to about 8. That is the point at which Joe Cito said, "I can't do this project for that kind of money. You need to find another director." So after about 2 years and a lot of money spent on prep, Canon had a series of 3 writers do much scaled-down versions of the script. All were contractual rewrites of the existing material with certain character and dialogue consistencies. All were minus any elaborate special effects action sequences because they were too expensive. And best of the 3 was Ethan Wiley's take, which he was one of the screenwriters for House and House 2, in which Peter really doesn't become Spidey until the last sequence. This is the period in which Albert Pyun became involved. He had a record of getting the films done on time, and that's the nicest I can say about him. He's probably a really nice guy. He had done Captain America for Canon using a really terrible script by Michael Winter, who was scheduled to direct at the time. When I say terrible, I'm siding with Marvel, which let Canon know their displeasure in the same letter which praised Spidey to the heavens. And then he talks about on what happened when Canon couldn't make the film and ended up using sets for Cyborg, as noted earlier. Well, yes and no. Canon really never canceled the film. When Canon had fatal money problems, its founding cousins split. Yoram and Globus throwing in with some crook over at MGM and going off on his own. In lieu of severance, which Canon could not have paid anyway, Golan held onto the Spider-Man rights and threw out the low-budget scripts, returning to the original draft, to Barney's rewrite of our stuff. And he pitched it to Columbia, which loved it, of course, and wanted a rewrite. They hired Frank LaLoggia, who directed Lady in White, who rewrote our script and still with our R's and Barney's name on it. Sorry, there's just a lot of words here. But walked away when the Golan people started being crazy. They then hired Neil Ruttenberg, a client of his agent, and he did, of course, this is the writer saying, so he says a client of our agent, and he did yet another pass, though he still claims never to have read our draft. I like Neil, but he's mistaken. The telltale sign of being in the presence of Doc Ock's idiot henchman, created by Barney Cohen, and the coverage at Columbia said of the 3 scripts, they're all basically the same story. But then at Cannes again, Manacom crossed paths with the crooks from Carolco, who outbid Columbia and had grand plans. They distributed through Columbia TriStar anyway, and he spent a year as new Canon, selling off the ancillary rights piecemeal like TV and video to raise money, not an uncommon practice. He'd take a second chair at Carolco, but with the promise of a producer credit. And this is when James Cameron agreed to put Spider-Man on his plate, but refused to have Golan's name on the movie or the ads. Carolco had used a previous agreement with him which gave him this right, but they'd also contractually promised Golan the credit. This led to a slight feeling of betrayal on Golan's part, and a lawsuit. Carolco wanted to sell off ancillary and other rights at their own price, so they told the companies which in good faith had bought them from Golan to go fly a kite. More lawsuits. MGM, which had bought Canon, at least in name, claimed continuing rights to Spider-Man because the previous Canon, or maybe new Canon, was a little late on renewing their option payments to Marvel. MGM claimed the rights to the franchise, and so did Golan and Carolco. Yet another lawsuit. Cameron would not get his $1 million writer's fee unless he delivered a full screenplay to Carolco, which could, in their estimation, be budgeted at $60 million or less. That's a quote directly from their deal memo. And they were not about to get caught out with a project that went over, and Mr. Cameron had a history of, shall we say, excess. You cannot properly budget a treatment or an outline. You need a complete screenplay, which a production guy can go through the line by line to anticipate cost. Cameron did a marvelously expedient thing. He had simply had the top sheet of the existing script retyped and added his name to the list of writers. The script cover now said screenplay by Ted Newson, Barry Cohen, and James Cameron. And underneath that said John Brancato, Joseph Goldmari, and James Cameron. And the misspelled names juggled so cleverly that it appeared the cinema genius had gone through 2 complete sets of writers to create his masterwork. None of us even ever met Cameron, much less write with him. And the weird non-existent name Joseph Goldmari was a typo in the process of altering the authorship. The Golan script had a Xerox error on it, blanking out a tiny bit of the N in Goldman. In fact, it was absolutely the same script which had been budgeted in prep at Canon for a year, and exactly the same script that Menahem Golan had pitched to Columbia, and precisely the same script that Carolco had bought. It was a Xerox, with not a word changed, only the credits on the top sheet. And since Golan had properly budgeted the script at $30 million, all you had to do was double that, and Carolco okayed it. They obviously knew the shady deal Cameron pulled, but what the heck? So he made his $1 million by delivering a script. Nothing in the deal memo said he actually had to write it. Ow, what a schmuck. Jimmy Cammy, what a schmuck. So our script, rather Barney's rewrite of our script, was still intact as far down the line as the Carolco period. Months after that, Cameron, or more likely a writer pal working for him in anonymity, delivered his scriptman, a 40-page story which cobbled assorted bits from every previous draft, particularly ours, Frank Logia's, Ethan Wiley's, and as far back as Leslie Stevens. Carolco's own financial troubles exceeded the ones of Cannon, and Carolco went massively bankrupt. MGM scooped up the Spider-Man rights, including all previous drafts. Columbia, still eager to do the movie Cohen had pitched back in 1989, dealt separately with Marvel to buy movie rights. Both studios claimed to have the right to make Spidey. Just as ironically enough, both studios claimed to have the rights to make James Bond. So Sony/Columbia's head guy, John Calley, had been a chief at MGM/UA for years and knew of the loophole of the 007 saga. Kevin McElroy still had the rights to Thunderball and a boatload of original material done by him, Ian Fleming and Jack Whittingham in 1958 to 1960 prior to the first Bond movie. Cawley announced Columbia would make an alternative James Bond series. MGM/UA panicked. Though Bond films only came out every 2 to 3 years, they kept the company alive. A rival series would destroy the company. A big swap was arranged, MGM/UA getting the rights to the McClory Bond material, which included Spectre, Sony/Columbia getting full rights to Spidey, including rights and options for on all previous scripts in the family tree. Sony/Columbia consciously exercised the option on what was only termed the Cameron material, described explicitly as a 40-page treatment by James Cameron and a 115-page screenplay traded to Ted Newsom, John Brancato, Barney Cohen, Joseph Goldman, and James Cameron. In other words, Columbia, in theory, never received copies of all the interim drafts, just those 2 items. I guess they figured the Cameron treatment came first, out of which the screenplay was expanded, which is the usual and logical procedure. In this case, it was backward. I just had to share that because I thought that was really fascinating. And I know this is a long video, but this is a really long story. This is an absolutely huge, long process of this movie, of just basically a single Spider-Man movie making it to the big screen. It's a really long process. So in 1993 to 1990 to 1993 in Carolco, the Cannon Group went under, but Golan still had the rights to Spider-Man, which he sold to a number of entities, including Carolco, which hired James Cameron for $3 million to write and direct. Golan's only condition is that he had to be listed on the finished product as producer. So eventually, Carolco realized that accidentally give James Cameron a contract as basically his Terminator 2 contract, with Terminator 2 replaced Spider-Man. This contract gave Cameron approval of all on-screen credits, and Cameron would not agree to leaving Golan credit in his movie. Golan sued, and the whole thing went down in a flurry of lawsuits. Meanwhile, Cameron had already written a 31-page illustrated scriptment, kind of detailed outline with snippets of dialogue, and then an actual script. And according to the LA Times, Cameron painted Peter Parker in darker hues than the previous writers had. Morally ambiguous, profane, and sadistic, even sadistically violent. He's actually he's an older person. He's not a teenager in this script, this draft too. And I've actually seen this 31 illustrated scriptment, and it's really crazy. To be honest, it's an illustrated scriptment of a Spider-Man movie that I don't know if I'd want to see. You think that Spider-Man is a douche in The Amazing Spider-Man 2? Wait till you see James Cameron's treatment, which I'm going to try to put a link down in the video description below for you guys to check out too. I mean, he's robbing banks. Yeah, Spider-Man robs banks in this script. He viciously beats some guys to a pulp, like he's sadistically violent. It's true. He also gave Parker's love interest the name of Mary Jane Watson, who in the comics is a neighborhood girl attracted to Parker, but he also gave her this snobbish upper crust personality as several other girls in the original material, along with a drunken, abusive father, which would be carried over into the Raimi film, of all things. And the arch criminal is a small-time hood accidentally invested with electromagnetic powers resembling the comics Electro. Don't even call him Electro. It's just some guy who has powers like Electro. And Cameron was also the first creator to come with the idea of organic rather than mechanical web shooters. You can read the entire scriptment, and then there's actually the 1993 final script, which is a link here, which I'll put links for both of those in the video description below. After that, Marvel realized that it had sold the movie rights to Spider-Man to 3 different companies, and under varying terms, the lawsuits were epic and bitter. By the time the mess was sorted out, Hollywood was finally waking to the big screen potential for superhero films, and Columbia snagged the rights. leading the Sam Raimi films. Actually, they snagged the rights because they made a trade for Bond rights. So MGM can still remain afloat, which, to be honest, like that's really true. And that was like back in the day when this guy was talking about how Bond is pretty much the main reason that's keeping MGM afloat. And that's even more true to this day, like especially right now. Bond films are one of the few things that are keeping MGM in business. So James Cameron's Spider-Man, they had the idea that Arnold Schwarzenegger would play Doc Ock, which I think is really not the best idea. But Columbia was interested in producing the movie, but James Cameron joined the project and resubmitted the existing script with a rewrite with his name attached in a schmuck move. And for a rehash of this cyclotron-based adventure, producers hoped to get Arnie as Doc Ock. That didn't work. So James Cameron's Spider-Man Take 2 happened. And eventually Golan was able to actually get Cameron to contribute to the script, and he crafted a new plot that took some elements from previous versions, but now features Electro and the Sandman as the movie's bad guys. Cameron's script went heavy on the profanity, and the story would have culminated with a battle atop the World Trade Center. But the movie's most eyebrow-raising scene would have been a Spider-Man and Mary Jane lovemaking session that mimicked the mating rituals of arachnids on top of the Brooklyn Bridge. Because why the fuck not? And yeah, it's pretty crazy shit. So then, of course, you also have the whole idea where you have Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 and 5, which never happened, which are going to feature the Lizard Vulture and the Vulturess. So, because even despite the disappointing audience response, Spider-Man 3 was still a huge hit, guaranteeing another installment. So the first lofty idea was to shoot 4 and 5 back-to-back, Lord of the Rings style. Then Sony committed to shooting 5 and 6 as a succession before cameras even started rolling on a fourth. Raimi's first plan was to finally transform supporting character Dr. Kirk Connors into the Lizard. Then it looked like the movie's villain would be the Vulture. Sony began negotiating with John Malkovich for the part of Spindly Old Villain, and also up for consideration was Anne Hathaway's Felicia Hardy as the Black Cat, but for reasons never fully explained, the movie would ignore her feline alter ego and instead turn her into the Vulturess, because Anne Hathaway would never work as a cat-based superhero character, which is a bunch of bullshit because you play Catwoman. Raimi was never happy with any version of a script for number 4, and when Sony pushed him to commit to filming on a certain date, he instead chose to walk away, taking Tobey Maguire with him. Rather than try to find a replacement, Sony opted to reboot the series, leading us to where we are right now. And yeah, that's pretty much the story of Spider-Man. This long, drawn-out, just full of litigation and all kinds of different drafts, and the same drafts being submitted with James Cameron's name attached, and James Cameron's idea of a abusive, profanity, laced Spider-Man who's swearing like a sailor, robbing banks, and banging Mary Jane like a spider, literally, in a tarantula mating ritual on a top of the fucking Brooklyn Bridge. So I just said that right there just sums it up right there for you. I mean, you think the Spider-Man movies we have now are bad or ridiculous? These original ideas are 10 times worse. So that gives me a new perspective on not only Raimi's films, but what Webb has done so far, because you could have had Spider-Man the Monster movie with Man Spider as your protagonist. Peter Parker turns into a giant man spider because he got mutated by his boss named Dr. Zork. Or you could have Doc Ock have an annoying sidekick and have a stupid catchphrase of "Okie dokie," which is worse than anything that any villain. Okie dokie is worse than "It's my birthday and it's time to light the candles." Okie dokie is 10 times worse. So you could have had 10 times. You could have had a Spider-Man movie directed by the same guy who directed the Captain America 1990 live-action piece of shit, Albert Pyun. Albert Pyun himself could have directed a Spider-Man movie. So things could have been way, way worse. And I think it's just, I just thought I thought it would be a cool idea for a video to do. I just think it's really fascinating. This is really a really long, long, long path that the wall crawler took to actually get a feature film. And putting that into perspective, Sam Raimi's film, which I watched again recently, which I'll go on more on, in the next review, the next video after this. Excuse me. Putting it in perspective, I watched it again and I thought it wasn't that impressive, but to be honest, it's not as bad as any of these other ideas. So, for what it is, could have been much, much worse, which I'll get into soon enough in the next video on what I liked about the Raimi film and what I didn't and so forth. But anyway, folks, thanks for watching my video, the first episode of the Never Wars, where talked about, I talked in depth about what I was able to find, the information I was able to find on the Spider-Man films that never came to be, that were planned but never happened, or were in conception phases but never really got a green light before Sam Raimi's film. And stay tuned for more episodes of this show where I'll talk about other movies that were never made. I know I talked about Alien 3 before. I might revisit that. Why not? Talk about all the different scripts and all the ridiculousness and go even more in depth on Alien 3 and the unproduced scripts and the script that got produced about a stupid wooden planet and a few other stuff like Silver Surfer, which was a movie that was, they were going to make, but it never happened. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. I'll go off of some research that I have in the book, Greatest Science Fiction Movies Never Made and Tales from a Development Hell and so forth. And I just think that'd be a fun subject to do a series of videos about, because I find it really fascinating to talk about movies that, never happened but could have. Like in an alternate dimension, these movies could have existed. And in Spider-Man's case, it's a good thing they didn't happen. But anyway, if you feel differently, that's cool. If you wanted to see any of these movies, that's perfectly fine. Me, I'm fine with what we got so far. But anyway, folks, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys later. See ya.